In this video, Jim Knipe will talk about everything EMDR therapists need to know and did not learn in their basic training. Jim Knipe will talk about working with complex clients with complex PTSD. He will talk about defenses like avoidance. First of all, why some clients have strong defenses, and more importantly, what to do with these defenses, how to work with these defenses in our EMDR work. If you're an EMDR therapist, you definitely want to watch this video. Jim Knipe, welcome to the Art and Science of EMDR, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for letting me be here. And I'm so happy to have a chance to talk to a huge number of people. And what I hope with this is that as each of you is listening to this, you are able to see how it maybe is going to be a help to you in working with some of the people that you have tried EMDR with, but it hasn't been quite successful. You've tried the standard protocol and you run into some trouble with that. I have done some writing and in some of the workshops I've done to develop what I call tools, EMDR tools, to help with this type of situation. How to use focus sets of bilateral stimulation to really help people move through other elements of their problem besides their dysfunctionally stored traumatic memories. And I will be talking about that today. These are some slides to kind of make things a little clearer to people. I've used a language of ovals. You see an oval there that is meant to represent a person's apparently normal self state. And what these ovals will represent are different states of mind that a person might have. So what my approach is, in the different things I've talked about, it is based on Francine Shapiro's wonderful innovation of understanding that every person has a way of processing information following an unpleasant event. For example, if I see someone walking outside my house and all of a sudden they fall and they hit their head on the sidewalk and there's bleeding, and I go out, I don't know this person, but I call an ambulance or I try to get some help for that person. After that event is over and taken care of, I'm still going to have flashing images in my mind, probably for the rest of the afternoon about that. And maybe even that night, and I'll even talk to it about someone in my house. And the next day I might think of it again. When I think of it again, it might not be quite as disturbing. It might not be so much of a flashing event. And so that is the work of the adaptive information processing model. A week later, I could look out to the same place on the sidewalk and remember it, but it's just a memory now if it doesn't tap into my dysfunctional memory networks. And so that's how usually people get over things that are unpleasant without benefit of therapy. However, we all know there's such a thing as trauma memories. When I'm talking to clients early in the therapy process and they're telling me about they have some trauma memories, I will help them kind of take a look at that. And for most people, it's clarifying to talk about these memories as trauma relivings, because that's how it feels. The point of therapy is to turn these relivings into normal memories where they don't get flashed, they're not flashing in the mind anymore. But reliving is like you're back in the original situation. Now, this can happen in a big way when a person is very dissociative and you start talking about their childhood and all of a sudden you look over and they're talking like a 7-year-old child and they've really switched into that identity. Now, that's the extreme example of it. But trauma reliving can happen in many ways. You can say to the person, well, tell me about your family. Tell me about your mom and dad. They might start having a feeling inside of discomfort in some way, which tells you there's a bit of a reliving that's happening there. And the trauma reliving parts can be relatively minor, or they can be huge and have a major impact on the person's ability to be normal in the world. And they even can be so intensely disturbing that they are dissociated, so that the person is not able actually to access them. They're outside conscious awareness. When that happens, these traumatic events still intrude into the person's functioning, but maybe not in a way that they remember the events that have happened. So this is just some basic guidelines here. Now, are you all able to see these slides pretty well? What I'm looking
Yes.
at here are the different ways that a dysfunctional childhood, an unhappy childhood of various kinds, can impact the development of a person's dysfunctional personality structure. We all know about how a person can have a memory that is still flooding into their mind maybe years later, and in a very upsetting way, a negative way. And this is one of the things that EMDR was originally designed to cope with when a person has PTSD about a particular event. It's true, though, however, that most people that come into therapy don't just have single incident trauma. There might be something from age 7, there might be, and then something from age 10, there might be something from age 17 and then 27 and from last week. There can be many different ways in which a person comes into therapy with many unfinished pieces of traumatic experience that flood into the mind in a way that's very unhappy and is disturbing for the person, and is especially difficult for the part of the personality that wants to look normal, be normal, and feel normal, because looking normal, this is ANP from structural dissociation theory, looking normal, appearing normal to other people is essential for maintaining connections with others. If a person looks weird, they are jeopardizing their connections with others. So for that reason, there's another personality part that tends to be developed to cope with that problem, which we can call psychological defense. And defense, that's a term that goes way back to Freud, but I'm using it here, and other people have used it in different ways, but I'm using defense here as a way to say any action, any mental action or behavior that has the purpose and the function of blocking the intrusions from unresolved memory material into the mind, the consciousness of the part of the personality that's trying to look normal and be normal. And that can be an avoidance defense. In other words, oftentimes a person might say, I don't want to think about what happened with my stepfather, or I don't want to think about that car accident where I almost died. I don't want to think about whether my husband might be having an affair with his secretary. I don't want to think about these things. These are avoidance defenses, things, they're actions a person is taking mentally that if they're effective, they will block disturbance from coming into their present consciousness. Avoidance is the one that's most common, but also we have other defenses that can occur. A person might have an idealized image of something that prevents them from knowing the full extent of the unpleasantness and the disturbance and the horrors sometimes of traumatic events. An idealization defense is an overly unrealistic, idealized, positive image of something. It can be of self. We call that narcissism. Or it can be an image of another person. One woman came into therapy after she had been beaten up by her husband, probably many times, hospitalized twice, once with broken bones. And she came into therapy and said, you know, my friends say I should leave him, but he loves me. I know he does. He's a good man. He doesn't mean it. There was an idealized picture of her husband that was preventing her from really seeing the situation clearly. And that's something that does come up. And that's a different type of defense that blocks post-traumatic material. And another type of defense, which comes up very often, is a shame defense, which is an odd thing for some people to think that how could shame be a defense? It happens with children. It's better to be, in your mind, a bad kid with good parents than a good kid with bad parents. Because if you're a bad kid with good parents, you can try real hard to be perfect, and maybe then they will be loving with you like you need. It happens a lot with people who are sexually assaulted, like someone out walking in a park and some guy jumps out of the bushes and there's a sexual assault. It's sadly common when someone has that type of experience that have a lot of shame about themselves. I shouldn't have been walking there. I shouldn't have been dressed that way. I shouldn't have been, you name it. So shaming, self-shaming is also a defense sometimes that blocks a full awareness and understanding of a traumatic event. And what defenses, I don't know if you can see the whole thing. There are a lot of pictures on the side here that block some of the slides, but I'll say what's blocked if that's a problem. Defenses contain positive affect. They don't contain negative affect like traumatic memories do. They contain positive affect. And that's what we target with EMDR, to focus on the positive affect that is connected with the defense, do sets of bilateral stimulation, and we can count on then the defensive affect diminishing, which is a good thing, although it reveals sometimes a lot of unpleasant negative affect connected with trauma. So what do you do? Well, I'll be talking in a minute about how to handle that. A third category of damage that's done with children especially is separate identities that are created because of the circumstances. They're adaptations to a very unhappy life situation of a child. And a person might come into therapy looking kind of like the circle there, to the circles right to the left, where they have an apparently normal part, but that part is burdened. That's a term from Rick Schwartz's IFS theory. That part is burdened by many different types of relivings and defenses and problems in really having adequate connection with other people. And as therapy proceeds with someone who has this condition, sometimes you start to see other parts of self that previously were off the radar for that individual and unavailable. So the main reason I'm showing all these ways in which an unhappy early life experience can cause dysfunction is to say that bilateral stimulation, focused sets of bilateral stimulation can resolve each of these three types of problems. And I'll show the problems again. These are the three types of problems I'm talking about. So that's the main thrust of what we're doing here, talking about different types of self states. Now, oriented parts, trauma reliving parts, defensive parts. These different parts may be relatively co-conscious, or they may be really inaccessible to each other, where a person has these different parts inside, but at any given time, their sense of self can shift so that sometimes they're entirely in their apparently normal part without much access to the other two parts. And then with certain triggers, something else can happen. A person's sense of self can be totally with all the emotions and sometimes even the cognitions and the pictures of reliving a traumatic experience. And this is just really unpleasant for that person. And
Jim, I have a question for you.
Oh,
And
sure. Yeah.
I mean, I have a lot of questions for you, but let's start with one.
Okay.
You mentioned the positive affect that is associated with the defense, and then we're using bilateral stimulation to work with the defense, as opposed to what we learn in basic EMDR training that we use bilateral to reprocess traumatic memories. What are some of the risks that are associated? Because the defense is there for a reason, right? The defense helps the client not to access this traumatic material that can be overwhelming. So how do we deal with that?
Good question. And I think what I have noticed and what I think is a guiding principle for me is that when a person is holding in mind an image or a memory or anything really that is distorted, it's not consistent with what most people would call reality. And they hold that in mind and we do the bilateral stimulation, the distortion lifts. That happens with PTSD because there's a distortion. If a person is in your office talking about something that happened when they were 10 years old and they're full of terror, well, your office is safe. So it's a distortion. And the standard EMDR lifts that distortion away. If a person is being defensive in your office and saying, I'm here to get some help with these nightmares I've been having and all these arguments with people, but I don't want to talk about the past. That's an avoidance defense. That sense of avoidance, I'm doing myself a favor by avoiding, that will lift away when we target the urge to avoid, the deep urge to avoid. So does this answer your question? I don't know if I got at it.
Yes, absolutely. And we did mention the level of urge to avoid throughout the month. We had our weekly challenges,
Okay,
so we did talk about this content. So yeah, thank
good.
you.
I won't be able to get to everything here. This is like, this whole presentation now is going to be a sort of a Cliff's Notes version of some of these ideas, not any kind of full explication of it all. But thanks for your question. And any others that have questions, that's fine with me. So self can also be caught in a defense. If a person says, I'm just going to get drunk tonight, I don't want to think about the things that are on my mind. I don't want to think about my childhood. I don't want to think about how awful it was at work today. I'm just going to get drunk. That's a defense. Addictions can be a defense against the emergence of affect. So now I'm going to quickly go through this. I'm talking here about almost the magic that happens with bilateral stimulation. This is Francine's wonderful discovery. And she applied it first to traumatic memories, post-traumatic stress, but it can work with other kinds of distortions in a person's experience too. I'm just going to list things. I'm not going to talk about the origins of this research. It's all listed in my book and in other places where the research that's gone into this, how bilateral stimulation has certain effects on mental distortions of various kinds. If you're holding in mind something very disturbing from the past and you engage in sets of bilateral stimulation, expands the associational networks so that you see more of the context of the thing that is so disturbing. That in itself can be quite helpful sometimes for a person to think more realistically about it. Bilateral stimulation reduces sympathetic arousal. So a person is really thinking about something and it's very scary. Some sets, it isn't quite as scary, or it reduces rage, it can reduce shock, it can reduce even inappropriate positive affect connected with something that is overly idealized. Bilateral stimulation can change from a reactive, fast thinking about something, an immediate response, which is how many emotional problems are characterized, to more slow examination of something that is upsetting. This borrows quite a bit from Daniel Kahneman's work on thinking fast, thinking slow. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for his work with this, and actually he died about a month and a half ago, but he's at age 91. So he's a very important contributor to this, and his approach, his ideas are part of how bilateral stimulation, I think, is effective with people. Ad de Jong in the Netherlands has talked a lot about how bilateral stimulation interrupts working memory. And that's so that a person can try to think of something disturbing, but if they're doing some bilateral stimulation, it subtracts from their ability to hold that trauma memory in mind. And that actually weakens the memory, maybe weakens the avoidance defense. There are many other ways in which bilateral stimulation now is shown to be something that is quite effective in doing all these very positive things. Pagani, all this is listed, but I want to mention Pagani's work in Italy, where he has actually had people do an EMDR session while they're in a CAT scan machine. And they go through it with a disturbance in mind. They do the buzzers back and forth, and he can watch the actual shifts neurologically that happen while they are engaged in sets of bilateral stimulation. So I just want to mention this because it's important for us to know there's a real strong scientific basis for what we do when we're doing EMDR with somebody. Now, bilateral stimulation will strengthen positives, will reduce the emotion of negatives, which is what we do in EMDR phases 4 through 7, 4 through 6. And defenses, what we target is the positive affect of defense, the positive affect of relief, idealization, containment, the urge intensity, those things. I know I'm talking very fast here. I'm realizing that. I hope it's not too fast. So this is how we do it. If it's a single incident trauma that we're focusing on, we'd use the standard procedures that you learned in your level 1. If we're targeting a defense, we look for the positive affect of the defense. After the person realizes this defense maybe isn't consistent with what I want from therapy, all they need is a glimpse of that for it to be effective. And if a person has dissociated parts inside, different parts of the personality, some of which may be conscious, some of which are kind of lurking in the background, what can we do? We can help that person form a connection between the part of self that is conscious and aware and other parts that are only maybe dimly known, or maybe the only evidence of that part is a feeling that is puzzling to the apparently normal part of the personality. And we form a connection, whatever we can, a thread of connection that can be expanded. And that becomes the way in which we can begin to help the person put these parts back together into an integral functioning single personality structure. So what do we do when a person has too much affect, too much to use standard EMDR? There's a lot of things we can do, and here's one of them. One guy, he was telling me about an abuse incident that happened when he was a kid, like 2.5 years old, where a babysitter really caused a lot of pain to him in a way that was puzzling and hard. And he was telling me about it. He had never told anyone else about it. I said, 0 to 10, how disturbing is that right now when you think of it? And he said, 25. You know, it was way over the top. And he said, I just want to hit somebody right now. Well, I was glad he told me that. But that's one example of a problem where standard EMDR is you need to have some additional measures to really help it be effective. Another situation that can come up is when a person is telling you about something that sounds kind of traumatic for them, like, you know, my stepfather used to touch me in a way that was inappropriate. Does it bother you? Think of it happening. 0 to 10. How disturbing? No, it's a 0. But when they tell you that there's a hint that they really are much more disturbed by it, and there's a kind of a denial in place or some other type of defense that is keeping them from having a full recognition of how impactful this was. So when that happens, what can we do? We can use what I call the loving eyes approach, which is basically asking the client to, from the safety of the office with you, visualize the child they were. You know what 8-year-old girls look like. You know, can you see yourself as an 8-year-old girl? Just see yourself. And sometimes it helps to help them visualize in general before asking that. You know, you can imagine what your front door looks like or what your car looks like. You can even close your eyes and imagine what I look like across the room from you right now. Just help them see that they have this power of visualization. And then visualize the child they were. And then, can you, the adult you are today, use your imagination, look back through time, look at her, see what you see. Just see what you see. You don't do the usual phase 3 setup. You don't ask for image, representative image, cognitions, emotions, sensations, what you'd rather think about yourself. You don't ask those things. You just say, look at her and see what you see. And as you look at her, follow my fingers. And then after every set, you ask the same question, basically the same question. When you look at her now, what do you see? What this will do is it'll give the dual attention that is essential to the working of EMDR, but it's much more gentle for some people. And often they will go back and fill in all the material, all the information that you usually would ask for in phase 1. But it's a method that is very helpful for people. I'm mentioning it now It's helpful to see videos of this working and transcripts that are in some of my writings if you're interested. So, but this is a good thing. This loving eyes method, that's what we call this. And I find it quite useful. Targeting and resolving psychological defenses, particularly avoidance, idealization, and shame, but also addictive disorders, things like that. Addictive disorders usually have an element of avoidance and idealization and result in shame afterwards. So the back of the head scale, funny word, funny label for something. It is basically a way that when you're working with a person who is vulnerable to dissociating, finding out how dissociated they are right now. In other words, how much contact with the safety of the reality of your office does this person have versus going in to their traumatic stuff, maybe way too far for them to be able to use the bilateral stimulation, the dual attention that is necessary for that to work. Here's a picture that kind of indicates this. I ask a client sometimes when I'm using this, I'll kind of act it out for you right now. Think of a line that goes from out here all the way to the back of your head. I don't go to the back of their head. That's too intrusive, but I'll demonstrate this way. The line has this point out here, which represents all you're thinking about, all you're aware of right now is just my office. You can see my books. You can hear the bird out on the limb outside the window. You can hear sounds in the building that are kind of muffled. That's what this represents. You're just aware of being here right now. The place of the back of your head means that even if your eyes are open, you're completely in that memory. Now, saying that sometimes the person will start to go into that memory. So you want to say it in a kind of a non-hypnotic way. This is totally present. This is in the memory. Point with your finger right now where you are on this line. And many people, will say that they're kind of right behind their ear or right here. In other words, they don't have the dual attention that's necessary for bilateral stimulation to have a positive therapeutic effect in resolving that memory. So, many things you can do to help a person come out. You can toss objects back and forth. You can kind of walk around the room together. You can ask arithmetic questions. That's a good one for helping a person come right back. Marshall Inahan suggests putting a drop of water in the hand. Any of these things will help a person come back. And what you want to do is have the person be in therapy in this dual attention zone as measured by the back of the head scale. Co-consciousness, simultaneous awareness of safe, present, and traumatic past. Okay. Now, when you've done that, then you're ready for using the CIPOS method. CIPOS stands for constant installation of present orientation and safety. And this is how it works. You start with the back of the head scale. You can't quite see it on the screen, maybe. It's here fully present, over here completely dissociated. You start with that. You start with a person being completely present, and you help them become completely present before you start. But tossing objects is one way to do that. And then you have a prior agreement. You discuss it with a person. How many seconds would you be able and comfortable going into that trauma memory and then coming right back out? And I usually suggest to people maybe 8 seconds. It can be between 2 and 9 seconds. I don't want to, people want to kind of prove that they're really motivated for therapy sometimes by wanting to extend that out to a longer period of time. I discourage that because the point of the CIPOS method is to help a person learn the important skill of coming out of their traumatic stuff, coming out of it, so back to safety. And that's a skill that many people that come into therapy with a dissociative condition don't initially have. So it goes this way. I ask the person to go into the traumatic material for a pre-agreed upon period of seconds, and then back to orientation, which is now bigger than it started. And then I ask them to go back in for a brief period of seconds. Again, no bilateral stimulation while the person is in their traumatic stuff, because that invites more disturbance, that invites more traumatic information. So initially in this process, you only ask them to go in for a period of seconds without bilateral stimulation and then return to safety. And the bilateral stimulation then can be paired with safety, which strengthens it. And you can repeat this over and over until the person is able to hold in mind with both the safety and the trauma material. And usually this can be accomplished within one 90-minute session. And even shorter than that for some people after they've gotten used to how to do this. But usually this is a one-session deal. And they can then proceed with EMDR phase 4, which is what we're all familiar with. So basically that is CIPOS. Now I wanted to mention one more thing, which is, I think, very useful and very important. Bilateral enhanced internal dialogue. Sometimes when a person comes into therapy, they have many different parts of self, each of which is anchored in trauma memories that are so intense, and these parts don't have a dialogue with each other. They don't talk to each other. They may be afraid of each other. They may be angry at each other. They may have a dominance submission relationship with each other. After therapy's proceeded for a while, oftentimes, a lot of that traumatic material has been cleared out. So the person can think of what happened when they were 7, and they no longer have a big disturbance about it. They know what happened, it's sad, but they aren't, the trauma's been cleared out that way. But it can happen sometimes that it doesn't go that simply. And I'm going to show some slides here that just an example of what can happen when there is a need for internal dialogue between different dissociated parts, which is often the case. A person I worked with years ago came in with clear DID, and we worked with many different aspects of that, including traumas that had happened early in life. When we got to 14, and the things that were happening that she was remembering from 14, she said this: I'm ashamed of my 14-year-old part. I can't forgive her. I don't like her. I don't want to integrate. She knew that word. I don't want to integrate with her. I don't want to have anything to do with her. This was a big obstacle to the achievement of this client's long-term goals of having an integrated personality, that she didn't have to have, hide things from others. And it was a big problem for her. And she wanted to become a person who was whole and complete in the way that we would consider normal. So this was the situation. And I asked her, when you think of that child, what is the emotion you feel? When you think of what happened, maybe when you have an image of the sexual abuse that occurred with your father. And she said, I'm ashamed. I'm so ashamed. I don't want her to be part of me. What came from next, and we worked to get to this point, was she was able to say, I hate father for what he did. I really do. And with a continued sets of bilateral stimulation, she came to this also. I love father for all the times he gave me support. Now, this was buried. This was not something she was aware of. At least she didn't mention it at all in describing to me what had happened. But it was really clear that this was an ambivalence on the inside that she had that was preventing her from proceeding into wholeness that she wanted. So what I suggested was a dialogue inside, facilitated with bilateral stimulation. And what do I mean by that is this. I asked her to think of a representative moment of the abuse. She was able to do that. When you think of that, what does the part of you that hates father have to say? Stay with that. And when the other part of you that loves father hears you say that, what does that part want to reply? Stay with that. And what does the part that hates have as a reply to the reply? Stay with that. This was very useful for her because of all the ways in which bilateral stimulation, remember, can bring into a context more information. It can reduce the fear that is there and sometimes separating internal parts. And this is an important issue because Colin Ross, a name you might remember, you might know, has pointed out in his view, and I think it's probably true, that every instance of severe dissociation in personality comes from ambivalent attachment to some perpetrator. And this is a way of dealing with that effectively. So this is the end of my slides. I have more slides, but that's enough for now.